Hello and welcome. Thank you for taking time to join us today for our webinar, Security Risk Assessment, More Than a QPP Requirement. My name is Michelle Brunston. I'm a Health IT Advisor here at Telligen, and we are so excited to have a Telligen partner and one of my colleagues, Dan Friedrich, share his wealth of knowledge on this topic today. We both work with small, underserved, and rural practices in Iowa, Nebraska, North Dakota, and South Dakota. And as advisors, we often hear questions surrounding the security risk assessment. It's an extremely important topic to understand, yet it can be overwhelming and daunting. You hear so much about the difficulties of it. And so we hope today that we can knock down some of those walls and help you become more informed. Now I'd like to talk about a few housekeeping items before I introduce Dan. You will be able to download the slides and the recording for this webinar on our TelligenQPP.com website by going to the Resources tab and then under that Webinars. And that'll be available in the next day or two. Your lines have been muted to avoid any unnecessary background noise. However, we will leave time at the end of the webinar to open up the lines for your questions. And following the discussion today, we will ask you to complete 3 polling questions to see if you found this material helpful, something that you can take back to your practices. We really value the feedback you share with us, so please take time to complete that. Now I'd like to introduce Dan. Dan Friedrich is the Director of the Center of Advancement of Health Information Technology at Dakota State University. Dan is a certified information systems security professional with 40 years of experience in information assurance and adult technical instruction. Dan regularly speaks at Dakota State University offerings as well as at conferences as a privacy and security expert. Dan is based in Madison, South Dakota, and is widely regarded as an expert in healthcare privacy and security issues. He leads the South Dakota and North Dakota efforts for Transforming Clinical Practices Initiative, or TCPI, and we are very happy to have he and his team on our Telligen Small, Underserved, and Rural Support, or QPP SURS. Welcome, Dan, and thank you so much for presenting on this important topic today.
Thank you, Michelle. I'm assuming that my line is unmuted at this point?
It is. You're all ready to go.
Well, and thanks, Telligen, for this opportunity, both on a larger scale and specifically to talk about risk assessment. I know it's a real challenge for small practices, and as Michelle so nicely put it, I have a lot of experience, which is a very nice way of saying I'm old, and I've chosen a career path that takes me down a spot where most people don't want to go, risk and risk analysis. So you said it much better than I could. But as you say, I have spent a long career at this. I recognize we were the Regional Extension Center for South Dakota, and as far back as 9 or 10 years ago, we began to really recognize the struggles that small practices had with doing the risk assessment. And as many of you recall, as the audits started to happen for meaningful use, as they no doubt will for the quality payment program as well, once they started happening, most of the audits that they caught people on were related to the risk assessment piece. So it's really a double-edged sword. It's a yes-no question, so that really leads people down the path of saying, well, of course we did, or sure we did. And that can be a real gotcha question. So we're going to cover a little bit of that space today, and as Michelle said, hopefully we're going to take some of that mystery out of it. I'll apologize up front for a few of my slides are really text-heavy, but when we reach one of those text-heavy slides, wait for the 2 or 3 after it, and we're going to try to break it down a little bit for you so that you'll be able to get a clearer picture of what they're actually saying there. And the reason I want to base what I talk about off of the actual rule is so that you don't get caught later thinking, well, I've done this, I feel like I've got all the pieces there, and you know, if we base everything that we're doing off the rule, then we shouldn't have to worry about not getting it done effectively or thoroughly. So, you know, we'll be looking over the next, I'd say about 45 minutes or so. I'll try to get done by about 10 minutes till 1 so that Michelle can ask her questions and we can leave a little time for people to ask their questions. We'll be looking at what the actual requirements are from a legal perspective. From QPP, you know, the Quality Payment Program has a requirement for you to do an SRA. We'll then take off and look a little bit at, you know, how do we define what constitute risks so that you have a better understanding when you go to do risk assessment, what kinds of things you'll actually be looking for and what does that mean to you as a practice. And then we'll be looking at, finally, some of the elements of an SRA. You know, there are lots of different ways to do a risk assessment, and I won't focus in on any particular way. What I'd like to do, though, is spend a little time and give you the background so that you can kind of get a feel for it and then make your own decisions. As Michelle said, the recording will be available as well as the slides, and that's another reason why I have a couple of text-heavy slides in there so that you can get a link and you can actually have the verbiage in front of you if you want to take that and print it out. So those will be the objectives for the next 45 minutes or so, and let's jump right into it. So when we think about SRA and Quality Payment Program, you know, we need to think in terms of threats, assets, vulnerabilities, and where they intersect is what you start to think about as risk to your organization. So from the perspective of QPP, risk assessment is in the promoting interoperability section. It is one of the required elements in order for you to get your base score. So, and what that roughly amounts to is that clinicians, eligible clinicians, must fulfill those requirements of that base score before you can get any kind of score in there. So you are not eligible to get a bonus on having done SRA, and it's not really applicable in terms of percentage of your performance score because it's one of the base elements. You can find that, the specification sheet, at the link on this page, and we'll leave it at that for now. So when you think about risk assessment in terms of the Quality Payment Program, and we field this question quite a bit, you know, and it's very much an extension of the way they dealt with the SRA in the meaningful use days, in the fact that you do not have to perform your risk analysis during your reporting period. So let's say you went with a 90-day reporting period in 2018, and it happened to be, you know, July through September. You do not have to perform the SRA during that performance period. You do have to do an SRA or a review of that SRA within the time frame of the calendar year that you are doing. So for 2018, you have to do an SRA or a review during 2018, even though it doesn't have to be during the reporting period. So it does have to cover that period, however. So you can't say, I'm going to do my risk analysis in January, and I'm only going to cover, you know, risk analysis through January, February, and March, and then go on to do your performance period in July. And the reason for that is because if you start peeling back the layers of the HIPAA security rule, you'll see that you must do and they don't define a time frame, but you must do a risk assessment periodically, and if there are substantive changes in your operating environment. So it would be possible, for example, if you did that risk assessment in January upgraded your EHR product in May and then had your performance period from July to September, that you would have another requirement to do that SRA in there. So from a QPP perspective, you have to be able to show that your risk assessment period coincided and covered the period that you are claiming for your performance period. So again, the basics of that are, has to be done in the same calendar year as your performance period, does not have to be in the performance period, but it does have to cover that performance period. So here's one of those text-heavy slides that we're going to break up over the next few slides. What I really wanted to show you here is that, you know, this comes directly from the QPP program. The objective in this case under promoting interoperability is protecting patient health information. The measure is the SRA, and that measure ID is highlighted there as ACI trans PPHI. This is the 2018 one, but we're going to break down this heavy text over the next couple of slides. So when we begin to break this down, right, you are required to either conduct or review a risk analysis according to HIPAA. 164.308A1 is the HIPAA risk assessment standard, and we'll look at that about 3 slides from now, maybe 4. But you do have to follow the HIPAA risk standards. And what really becomes interesting about this when you think about it, HIPAA doesn't have a periodicity to it where you must perform one every year, but the QPP program does, as did meaningful use. So sort of by default, the industry standard has been conducting or reviewing an SRA at least annually. So, and that doesn't really have anything to do with HIPAA. That has everything to do with the programs that you are belonging to, like a quality payment program. So, but what it has done is it's crystallized across the industry the fact that typically people are doing a complete SRA every year and then a review the following year if their environment doesn't change substantially. So another thing that they learned from the meaningful use days, and they've done a better job of documenting here in the quality payment program, is that second phrase there of including addressing the security, which includes, and they call it right out, encryption of EPHI data that's maintained by your CERT, your certified EHR technology. So they've done some more work around encryption, and I've got a full slide on that, and we'll talk a little bit about encryption. I don't want that to let it slide by, though, because by calling it out here, it really, if you're going to have a culture of compliance in your practice, you need to figure out how you're going to deal with encryption. Either your vendor has to help you with it, or you have to do it on your own. But from a breach notification perspective, as well as a program requirement, you really need to deal with encryption. So that's something that we'll spend a little bit of time on in here, because I know it's a question that we're often asked, and it's something that a lot of places don't quite understand what their responsibilities are in that area. So the next part of this statement from CMS is in accordance with 45 CFR 312 and 306. Those are HIPAA standards. 312 is the encryption standard, where it says very directly that you must implement a mechanism to encrypt and decrypt, EPHI. Now, the feedback we normally get is the fact that this is an implementation spec and it is addressable. And so when people talk about addressable, they say we don't really have to do it, right? So I want to sort of put that notion to rest here on this slide, because the second half, 164.306, while it's really wordy, we're going to focus on the highlighted sections. that 306 really says implement if it's reasonable and appropriate, or you have to document why it's not reasonable, appropriate, and implement an equivalent alternate measure. So again, you either have to do encryption and decryption, or if you don't, you need to document why and show how you've protected equally as well as being able to encrypt. And it's so often the case, because this is an addressable implementation spec, it's important to understand that addressable doesn't mean it's optional. You either have to do it or you have to document why you didn't do it. So that's really an important perspective to have when you start thinking about your risk assessment and your security program going forward. And finally, you must implement security updates as necessary and correct identified security deficiencies that you found in your risk assessment as part of your risk management process. And to the letter of the law here, implement security updates as necessary and correct identified security deficiencies. That's huge, right? I mean, this sentence, if they would really want to push it, this is where you start talking about mitigation. I have found deficiencies, and according to the rule, it says I have to correct those deficiencies. This is where a lot of people start to say, whoa, wait a minute, right? If I bury my head in the sand and I don't know what's going on and I don't know what's bad, then I won't have to get caught up in this, oh, I got to correct all these identified deficiencies. If you have a breach, your risk assessment needs to have been done, and you need to have corrected those deficiencies. If you end up with a breach or you get audited and you've not done a risk assessment, you will be hit on that, without a doubt. You can mitigate your correction of identified deficiencies over time. You do not have to mitigate everything as soon as you discover it. So what you do need to do is understand your environment and have a plan for curing those problems. So putting it all back together and again playing our highlighter trick, what QPP says you have to do on an annual basis is conduct a review, a security risk analysis that includes encryption of ePHI data, and implement the security updates as necessary and correct identified security deficiencies. So that's a mouthful, right? And from a small practice perspective, that can seem very, very daunting. You know, we work with organizations all the way from a single doctor practice up to integrated health systems. And in some places, I mean, if you're a 400 or 500 bed hospital system, right, you need to have a team to be able to deal with this effectively if you're going to do QPP. If you're a small practice, you know, you do not have to have a team, but what you do have to have is some ability to be able to show that you took it seriously and you went through a process and you documented that process and you have policies that surround that process. You just can't ignore it, because when QPP gets audited, and they will go through some round of auditing, you can bet by what they learned during the meaningful use audits that they'll be looking closely at this particular measure ID. So I just encourage you to not ignore this, right? The next few slides we'll be talking about, we'll give you some tools to be able to feel more comfortable about accomplishing this without thinking it's going to just ruin your practice, because it certainly doesn't have to. So we've talked a lot in the last 10 minutes or so about the HIPAA SRA requirement, and we're not going to get super deep into this because I think there are some other things that we want to talk about to help you get a basic understanding of risk analysis when you're going to do it. So The keys to this paragraph, though, are really about conducting an accurate and thorough assessment, right, where you have to look at the risks, you have to understand your vulnerabilities, and you have to really apply those across the three, what's called the security triad of confidentiality, integrity, and availability, right? So essentially that is making sure the people that need to know this have it available to them, they know it's the right information, and they know nobody else is going to get it. So that's really what confidentiality, integrity, and availability is about. It's about how do you deal with that information, whether that's held by you as the covered entity or as a business associate of yours, if somebody's processing that information for you. As we think about assessment versus mitigation, because people tend to struggle with this area, again, when they start doing SRA work, they start uncovering vulnerabilities, and they start thinking that they have to fix those vulnerabilities right then and there, right? So I would discourage you from doing that. I really believe that you have to have a discrete process here where you do the assessment and then you go after mitigation as a separate animal. And the reason you want to do that is because if you try to mitigate as you assess, you will oftentimes be doing multiple things. You will mitigate multiple things that if you had done all the assessment first, you could have mitigated one thing and really hit a lot of others along the way. So just like sometimes if you're taking a written exam, how one question will lead to another question or potentially cause you to have the answer to a question down the line. Same way with assessment and mitigation. I'm a proponent of not doing mitigation until after you've completed your assessment. So assessment is really a very structured process, or it should be a very structured process. It's about identifying your assets every place where there's PHI, and I mean every place, right? It's not just in your medical record. It's identifying specific threats to those assets, whether those are external weather threats in some cases. We live in the upper Midwest, so snowstorms and power outages, ice storms are always a possibility. Certainly tornadoes are a possibility. You know, hurricanes along the coastlines. You know, so every area of the country has specific threats to it. Now that's also including IT threats and attackers, those kinds of things. But I just don't want people to forget about the external threats to the organization posed often by weather. So a good assessment has to have some way of prioritizing, whether you use high, medium, and low, immediate fix, or you know, put it down the line. You can prioritize by cost. You can prioritize by time. You can prioritize any number of ways. But the important piece is that your assessment really should have some way of prioritizing these vulnerabilities, right? They can't all be critical. So we have to understand that as we go forward. And finally, and this is really kind of an important point about assessment, is when you understand that risk, you have a much better handle on how you may either reduce that risk through classic mitigation, transfer that risk to somebody else like through insurance. You know, it is certainly possible to accept risk. You know, as an organization, you can say, I know this is risky. We've done a cost analysis on it. We're just going to accept the fact that we do have this risk out there. And then finally, it's certainly possible to reject the risk. I never think that's any kind of good strategy because you really, if you know about it, you're accepting it. You're not really rejecting it. At times when you work with an outside consultant, you may say, well, they've found something that I don't really believe is a risk, so I'm just going to reject that out of hand. You know, if you're doing it yourself internally, you would never get to that reject. But it certainly, as part of the assessment, it gives you the tools you need to be able to say, what can we do with this kind of risk, right? I mean, if we can minimize it to a certain point, do we need to have data insurance? Do we need to, you know, transfer that off into some other way? Maybe at times you say, maybe it makes more sense if we can't handle this kind of thing internally to transfer that off onto a business associate and have them do some things for you that are more apt to provide that protection for you. So that's what an assessment will help you do, really understand if we want to do this or not do this. Mitigation, on the other hand, is really about reducing or eliminating, if possible, a threat, right? So there's really only a couple of ways you can reduce a threat. You can reduce it in terms of probability, how often is it going to happen to me, or you can, if it does happen, what is the severity of that incident? Those are really the only two things that you can reduce. Ideally, you'd love to eliminate them and saying, this would never happen to me, and even if it did, it wouldn't cause me any problems, right? But that's mitigation. So that's where you spend your money, is on the mitigation side. There are lots of resources out there for that. A couple of good ones that are, you know, NIST 800-53 is probably the premier resource. You know, it can be very technical, you know, but you can wade your way through it if you're a little bit technical. If you're not, I suggest getting some help with it. But it's certainly the premier place to find the information about security controls. There are other ways. I was a member of the Privacy and Security Community of Practice for the Regional Extension Center programs. We developed a security checklist that was focused around HIPAA and the HITECH Act, so that can give you a pretty good indication of the things that you should be doing to mitigate a lot of your threats. So there are resources out there that are available to you. I want to spend a few minutes here with this relationship, because I think this, again, is important to understand, because as small practices especially, it appears at times to be a little bit of a black art, and I just want to go through this to help you understand when you start doing risk assessment that you're going to encounter some of these terms and some of these concepts. And I think having a picture of this relationship can really help you through some of those questions maybe down the line. And so starting with those red boxes, you know, those are threat agents and threats. Typically, those come from outside of your organization. So those would be things like potentially an attacker on, you know, a hacker that gets in from the outside, potentially an internal employee, but that's, you know, not really an external threat as opposed, it's still a threat agent. It could be a tornado, it could be a fire, it could be, you know, any number of things, a power outage, it could be that ice storm that we talked about earlier. It could be any number of things that has a threat agent. And that really translates then to what is that threat, right? We have to have some external actor. We'll stay with weather for just a moment, right? So we've got weather as an external factor. What is the threat? The threat could be, say, a thunderstorm knocks out the power to the building, right? Bang, 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 knocks out the power, fries our server, completely annihilates all of our data that we've got stored on our server, right? So the actual threat is lightning and loss of data. The threat agent being weather. You know, a hacker could be let's call it a North Korean attacker. They're trying to get your data. They write a malicious script, so then they get that onto your network, right? So we've got these external forces, and these are things that you can't control, These are things that come at you from the outside all the time, all day, every day, and all you can do is deal with them inside of your organization. So you can't control those threats. Those are things that are going to be coming at you. You can control how you deal with those things, right? Because a threat needs to have a vulnerability for it in order to act on it, right? So when you start thinking about vulnerabilities, that really ties in with the asset in the green box. You have to have an asset that has value, and it has to have a vulnerability in order for a threat to even act on it. So from a vulnerability perspective, that could be something like, you know, our power line to our servers don't have any kind of electric surge protection on them. So that would be defined as a vulnerability. It could be our EHR product doesn't have a way to actually make me sign into it. It could be our computer workstations do not have any kind of screen protection, so that some kind of external threat of viewing it could happen. So when you look at vulnerabilities, you ideally want to add countermeasures, the other blue box there, to countermand or counter that vulnerability. So you'd like to say a specific countermeasure to, for example, that lightning storm would be to install UPS devices with surge suppression, right? So we use a countermeasure that minimizes the vulnerability, and that relationship between the vulnerability and the asset is really the risk. And if you can eliminate that vulnerability or break this cycle anywhere in this path, right? If you could eliminate the threats, you wouldn't have to worry about it. You would have no exposure. But you can't eliminate the threats. The only things that you can control in this relationship are the vulnerabilities and the countermeasures. So you have to reduce the vulnerabilities as much as you can or add additional countermeasures. When you implement a virus, think about this for just a second. Visualize that picture in your mind, right? When you are implementing an antivirus product, what are you really doing? You're eliminating the vulnerability of a malicious code coming onto your network. You're mitigating that threat with a countermeasure, right? So you're reducing that vulnerability, thereby reducing your risk and reducing your exposure. So it's important really to understand this relationship of all these things, understand what you can control, what you can't control, and in those gray boxes, that's what risk assessment does for you. It helps you understand your risk and your exposure because the asset is your PHI. So that's the whole point in a nutshell of SRA. Really help you understand the risk and exposure. Additional benefits are, okay, now if I start looking at these, how do I reduce my vulnerabilities? What countermeasures do I use? Because you can't eliminate the threats. So when you look at different kinds of SRAs, there's three major kinds. There are a few minor kinds, but really we're talking about either a quantitative analysis, a qualitative analysis, or some kind of hybrid model. Most everybody uses a hybrid model. Quantitative, very, very solid. You can really identify your greatest risks, and it's tied to a number. It's tied to a financial impact on your organization. To do it well, it's incredibly costly in terms of time. It's a very exhaustive process. It's really time-consuming. If you're going to have a traditional quantitative analysis performed by an outside agency. They are going to really delve into anything and everything, and probably will be asking you questions about quantifying the value of things that you're going to have a really hard time asking those questions or answering those questions. So, you know, for example, how much is your PHI worth in your EHR? Almost nobody can answer that question. So, hard to perform quantitative analysis unless you can really identify real numbers. Qualitative, on the other hand, you know, it has some cons too. It's a very subjective process. So a lot of times we don't quantify the loss as much as we should when we do qualitative analysis. It's much more common though. It's a lot quicker to complete. It's the way most places default to. Yeah, we sat around the table, talked about some stuff. We've done an SRA. I'm not going to shy you away from a qualitative process. What I am going to say, though, is that if you're going to follow a qualitative assessment process, you need to follow that process. You need to have an outline. You need to have it documented. You need to say this is what we did and this is what we found, right? When you do that, you can then begin to focus and really understand that risk from a qualitative perspective. And then a hybrid model, which is, you know, of course, as it suggests, some combination or pieces of each one of those things. You know, lots of tools on the market, and not only on the market, but tools in general that you can use to perform these types of analysis. Qualitative analysis, when you think about the Delphi technique, you're really talking about doing tabletop exercises and sitting around brainstorming on what the possible risks could be, identifying and analyzing those and saying, oh, I think this one's more important than that one. I think this one can't happen as much as that one can. And so if you're going to use the Delphi technique or SWIFT, you know, which are much more team-based approaches and trying to decide what if happens, if you're going to do that, I would encourage you to take that risk relationship image here and maybe blow it up and put it on the whiteboard in your space where you're doing that brainstorming, so that you can really help your team understand that relationship of those things, because that's what you're going to be brainstorming if you go into using the Delphi technique to try to understand your practice's risk. And again, I am not opposed to doing that. You just want to make sure that you are doing it in a structured way and you're documenting it so that you know how you're going to respond when and if you get audited, or heaven forbid, if you get breached in some way. Quantitative is much less often used in healthcare. It's typically in the financial sector and in chemical process industry and explosives and some of those other pieces where it's easier for them to quantify the numbers. Very difficult to do a complete quantitative analysis in healthcare because so many of the things we do are much more intangible. Doesn't mean they're less valuable, it just means they're less tangible and very difficult to assign a number to. So you don't see quantitative quite as often in healthcare. You typically see places that use some variation of, you know, a walkthrough to try to detect things that are on their surface bad, and structured what-if techniques to do this and qualitative, and then somebody ends up having to write the report. So, when you think about scope, so, you know, you need to be thinking about everything that contains PHI. So again, from the HIPAA rule, that includes potential risks and vulnerabilities to the confidentiality, availability, and integrity, and there again, we're that CIA, right? Who should see it? Is it right? And making sure that they can see it when they need to see it, of all your ePHI. So It's more than just your EHR product, and we run into this time and again with small practices, small individual practices, or even up to you know, multiple provider organizations, that the standard response is, my vendor's taking care of that for me. And that is learned behavior. So, but I'm here to tell you that your EHR vendor cannot provide all the necessary protections for you in terms of EPHI, because EPHI can be billing information, it can be appointment reminders, insurance claims information, anytime you run a report and store it on a local machine. What am I forgetting here? Email. Certainly email is a big driver of EPHI leakage as well. So whenever we hear that learned behavior, my vendor's got that taken care of for me, I just, the hair on the back of my neck stands up, because I know that that can't be true, and I know that it's put out there by quite a few people. So it is your responsibility as a provider to do this SRA, right? And so now if your EHR vendor will work with you to make sure that it's all protected, and they'll work with you to do a risk assessment of all your PHI, fantastic. I mean, that is a great place to be, as long as it's getting done. But so often we just hear, well, it's being taken care of. So we've talked a little bit about risk assessment, right? What the scope should be. The scope should be everything that's PHI related. I think it's also important for you to step back once in a while and think about what is the perspective, right? I mean, from what angle are we approaching this from? So the HIPAA points out that you need to have administrative controls, physical controls, and technical controls to protect your information. It's when you start to do risk assessment, you want to kind of think of it in this from this perspective. You've got those administrative controls. Those tend to be much broader. Those are policy statements. Those are the way we do things here. And they identify things like physical controls and technical controls that protect that patient information. But those are broad-based, typically policy-type controls. Who is my HIPAA security officer? When do we do backups? Where do we store information? How do people get to use their laptops when they go off our property? Those kinds of things are administrative controls where decisions are made, right? And they typically then dictate what the physical controls are going to be. Whose responsibility is it to open the doors? How many keys do we have to the building? Who has to close it down at the end of the day? You know, what are those physical controls that we're protecting things with? The policy will dictate whether or not you've got screensavers or whether or not your workstation point towards your waiting room, for example. The policies will drive how far back the next patient, you know, typically can stand. Policy drives the physical controls. Technical controls as well, you know, are driven by policy. Usually, with another interim step in there, the policy says something like, we have a data recovery plan, or we have a backup plan. We have a risk mitigation plan. Here's where you can find that plan. Then inside that plan are typically the technical controls. But again, they can be done right in policy. They can say, you know, our policy is that you must have a username and login to get onto our network. And that technical control then implements that policy in that sense. All designed to be a multi-layered approach to protect that patient information. So when you're doing your risk assessment, you need to be thinking about those administrative controls. Do we have policy that says how we're going to deal with this? You know, what are the physical controls in the space? how do they match up with our policy? Because again, where we begin to lose things, we create a policy or it comes as part of a policy manual and we adopt it and then we don't do what the policy says, right? So part of your risk assessment process has to be jiving your actual everyday procedures with what your policy says you're doing. So that can all be done at the tabletop in a Delphi format or a what-if format. Understanding your technical controls, have whoever does your technical work in the room with you when you do your risk assessment, because you need to understand if the policy says we're doing this, how are we technically implementing that? Are there gaps between the two? Because that's where we get those exposures and those risks. Looking for PHI, PHI is all over your organization, from your server room to the local hard drives, and up in the cloud more and more today. Certainly stored and archived in lots of different ways. Floppy disks, some organizations still have. If you're as old as I am, you'll recognize the real floppy disk days from the days gone by. Much more likely for today, people to be using thumb drives and SneakerNet to move information around. And again, we haven't talked about email because we could spend an hour on email. But be aware that from a risk assessment perspective, ePHI lives all over your organization, and you need to really identify where that comes from. So the next couple of slides, I'm going to show you the tool that we use. I'm not endorsing that. There are a number of ways to do it. I'm only using them for illustration purposes. So, when you think about the elements of a risk assessment, you need to have some way, and it can be a notebook, of identifying and documenting potential risks and vulnerabilities, right, so that are unique to your circumstances. And if those risks are somehow exploited, that can really gain access to your environment, right? So when we think about risks and threats, those are things like, internal flooding, tornadoes, snowstorms, ice storms. What if there's an explosion? When we do risk assessment for places, we understand and say, how far are you from the local fire department, right? That's all part of the risk equation. Are you doing anything? Is it likely, right? If I'm living in Florida, flooding certainly might be, snowstorm, probably not so much, right? But understanding that relationship to those external threats, how likely they are to happen, and if in fact they do happen, what is that impact to us, right? And then further on, do we have safeguards to deal with that or not deal with it? So whatever you use to document this, I encourage you to use something so that it triggers you to try to be as comprehensive and as thorough as you can. So, layering in on top of those external threats is the kinds of things that, you may have more variables to deal with if you're a larger organization, but you certainly have less resources to put into that problem as well, right? And when you start thinking about the safeguards, do you have that process? Do you have policies in place? If yes, great. What's the likelihood of not having this particular policy in place going to do to us? Those kinds of things. What kinds of safeguards do we have in place to be able to deal with those? So, and finally, I'll sort of wrap things up a little bit with business associates, because business associates are more than just a double-edged sword. Let me say it that way, right? You are no longer like you used to be. You're no longer responsible for what the business associate does, but you are certainly, you certainly should be cognizant of what they're doing with that information, right? And OCR Phase 2 audits really focused on that business associate relationship. Business associates can be fantastic because typically they will be very good at what they do, and they focus on what they do. so you can trust business associates by and large. When OCR does do an audit, they can ask for many, many elements, and they will specifically ask for your business associate's name and what type of service they offer you. So when you do your risk analysis, make sure you are plugged into that relationship about the BAAs. Who do our BAAs are? What do they do for us? How well are they protecting our information? So with that, I've covered a lot of ground. I apologize for the density of it.
The leader has unmuted your line.
But I'd like to open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, Dan. Wow, there is so much to consider. So I hope we have some people on the line that would like to ask some questions. I'll just open it up and go ahead and ask your question.
They're probably all sleeping by now.
No, I don't think so.
Hi, it's Lisa Sagwitz with Quality Insights. First, I'd like to say this is a fantastic presentation, very well done. One thing that I've been trying to find out with 2019 MIPS and the Promoting Interoperability, one of the measures talks about the API or Application Program Interface. I hear a lot about FHIR, the Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources, and I haven't been able to get an answer if practices and organizations need a business associate agreement to connect with an API or FHIR. Do you know that answer?
So, Lisa, I thank you for that question. I will have to find out where it's documented. My gut reaction to that is it would depend on what it is that what you're connecting to them for. And the reason I say that way is because, say, for example, you're connecting to an organization that's simply a pass-through organization, and you have an API to that pass-through organization. Then it really becomes part of transmitting, and they're simply passing through there. In almost all cases, I would say yes to they should have a business associate agreement if they are going to connect, because there really would be no reason to connect to somebody if you weren't having them process PHI for you.
Okay.
So that's not a total answer to your question. I don't know exactly where we can find that, but just, you know, my gut tells me that they should actually go after a business associate agreement with that group.
Thanks. That's what I'm thinking too, but yet the EHR vendor that's offering it, and it's a large one, is saying, well, we don't think so. But I think any time you provide patient access through another source, you have to be sure who's accessing it and that it is secure.
I would absolutely agree. And I would go at this from the approach, Lisa, that, you know, the old adage of better safe than sorry certainly applies in this case. And you kind of have to ask yourself, well, if somebody's going to go through building an API, why are they reluctant to sign a business associate agreement with you?
Okay, thank you. And the measure that this specifically is on in promoting interoperability is called Provide Patients Electronic Access to Their Health Information.
Sure. Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Lisa. Do we have another question?
I think you can do your poll, Michelle.
Yeah, I was going to say I'm going to open a poll. And Dan, do you have your contact information up next? Do you want to put that
I'm
slide?
sorry. I do. I'm always reluctant to show my picture.
Oh, stop. Stop it. Now I'm going to go ahead and open a poll. The first question is, did I take away something that I can use for future use? So I'll open that up, and if you could please complete that. Great. Okay, I'll close that. And then the next question, will I do something different as a result of this webinar? Go ahead and open that up for you. Okay, and I'll go ahead and close that. And finally, the last one, do I know more about the security risk assessment requirements than before I participated in this webinar? Great. Well, thank you so much to everybody. We can't tell you how much we appreciate taking your valuable time. I know it's always hard to find time to attend these webinars, but we truly hope that you were able to find something that you could pull from this. And Dan is so wonderful at answering questions and getting back with you. So we have his contact information here. And again, the recording and the slides will be made available in the next day or two on our website, TelligenQPP.com, under the Resources tab, and then just go to Webinars. Thanks again so much, and have a great day.